If you are in the Godzilla fandom, odds are you've at least heard of Kaiju Universe, a Roblox game that, up until fairly recently, was among the largest Godzilla fan games of all time. Obviously, some stuff happened with Toho, and they just don't have access to Godzilla Kaiju anymore, and there's also a bunch of controversies going on with it and all that, but the game is still up, and it has taken a pretty different turn since the whole Toho debacle happened, with the game now having its own original kaijus and its own original lore. By proxy, new scaling for the entire series. So, for this video, I'm going to be taking Godzilla Final Wars, who was once in this game prior to the whole Toho stuff that happened. In fact, he was actually my main when I played the game, and pinning him up against the entire new cast of the Kaiju Universe roster. I will be basically having this as a gauntlet run, meaning I'll be scaling the stuff within the kind of like lore and gameplay for Kaiju Universe, and then talking about if Final Wars Godzilla can beat what I mentioned. And then I'll just mention more impressive stuff after that, and then so on and so forth, until either Kaiju Universe gets completely obliterated or Final Wars Godzilla fails to match up to something. So this will be a little different than my usual style of content, but I feel like it makes a lot of sense for a gauntlet run video like this, especially since Final Wars Godzilla's whole thing is gauntlet running kaiju. So starting off with some of the least impressive stuff within the Kaiju universe, we have the mostly aquatic kaiju. Kaiju like Orath really don't have a lot going for them. We know that they can withstand a lot of military weapons like tanks, missiles, helicopters, stuff along those lines, but they're still shown to take some mild damage from it in gameplay, though that is most likely just a game mechanic, because given the lore for some of these other kaijus, I don't think it's really consistent to say that they are just weak enough to get like badly damaged by tanks like they can in game, especially once we get to some of the top tiers. But they're not really as durable as most of the kaiju they're based on, as there is pretty much no evidence to support that they just upscale all man-made weapons, meaning nukes could likely still affect them, which is kind of consistent with some of the other stuff for their scaling, as they themselves are relatively comparable to some nukes. That's not to say they're weak, just not like extremely impressive. Most of the lower tier kaiju in the series, I mean, they can still destroy buildings like to basically nothing and have feats in gameplay that can get into the multi-city block levels, but they aren't like stronger than like Zara Bomba or anything, at least not from anything we've seen thus far. Add on that the only like real lore scaling for any of these guys is that they fight each other, and Orath hunts whales, like large whales, probably blue whales, stuff like that, which is fairly impressive, but he's also like drastically bigger than a blue whale and is, designed for hunting. So, though I do think they could be mildly annoying to Final Wars Godzilla, as you'll see, he has more than enough scaling to kind of just obliterate them. Now, as for speed, they're definitely not slow, as most of the kaijus in the series kind of just scale to each other, and most of the kaiju in the series are at least in the light speed ranges, as they could just react to stuff like lasers and stuff, and there are arguments for even faster speeds than that. Though they're not really the most consistent, they do exist. So, how does Final Wars Godzilla stack up to that? And, well, by default, he kind of just gets all the scaling that the original Godzilla gets, plus more, as he is just a altered version of the 1954 Godzilla, who already took a hydrogen bomb, and that's how he woke up. A hydrogen bomb would already pretty much upscale almost anything these lower tier kaiju have shown in the series. So, yeah, off feats from before the film even starts, Final Wars Godzilla is already the stronger of the two here. He's also significantly faster, as he also has FTL arguments that he would end up upscaling by the end of the film through his combat adaptation, so he would just kind of be above the lesser kaiju in both raw power, speed, and obviously durability. So basically, when it comes to Final Wars versus Kaiju Universe's mostly aquatic kaijus, he's basically just doing what Monster vs. Godzilla did to Scylla to every single one of them. Next, we have what I think is the second weakest group of kaiju in the Kaiju Universe verse, And those are the lesser extraterrestrial kaiju. And though these guys are a lot more consistently in the multi-city block to even potentially town ranges, depending on how high you calc the building destruction, if you factor in that they basically just obliterate them into nothing, they really don't get that much higher than the previous group of kaiju. The only reason I put them above them is because, well, these guys are at least kind of implied to be capable of being threats to civilization, and you can kind of argue that they should have better resistance to man-made weapons and stuff, as pretty much all three of them are alien invasions by themselves. That said, outside having a lot more abilities, better hacks, and for the most part being more intelligent than the prior kaiju, they will still suffer from the same power disadvantage, durability disadvantage, and speed disadvantages as the previous group. So they probably also lose in a very similar fashion. I think they had the potential to be a lot more effective against Final Wars Godzilla, as at least annoying him, but they're probably all getting done about the same way that base Final Wars Gigan got done. After them, the next group that I think would be in the power ranking for Kaiju Universe would be the mostly aerial kaijus, which includes quite a few, and a couple have some pretty out there arguments that I'm about to get into, but for starters, a couple of them just aren't doing very well. Karimach, Heligris, and Noctera are all probably struggling even more than the alien kaijus would already. This is due to them lacking the same overall arsenal as the alien kaiju, and being kind of forced to stay aerial if they're going to do much, as on the ground they're just getting kind of just blitzed and overpowered. However, Vudan and Juju actually have some pretty insane arguments, as according to the still currently, for the most part, kind of canon lore for the character, Vudan is still technically Heisei Rodan. Now, I'm sure this is going to get changed and isn't entirely canon even right now, but if you were to take that lore at face value, he would automatically just scale to some of the more insane stuff of the Heisei era, which, unless you factor in some very, very shaky statements for Kiza Ghidorah and Final Wars Godzilla from not all official material, would automatically put him well above anything in the Final Wars film and anything in the Final Wars timeline. So, if you want to use that scaling chain for Vudan and Juju, Vudan would kind of just one-tap the Final Wars Godzilla with, like, no difficulty. Unless you think Final Wars Godzilla is the strongest Godzilla because some magazine that wasn't even, like, really fact-checked by Toho said so one time and wasn't even referring to him, they were referring to his roar. I mean, I guess you can use that as an argument, but I personally wouldn't. Or if you want to use that one statement that says Kiza Ghidorah is the strongest monster of all time, well, clearly referring to the Final Wars timeline exclusively and not all of Godzilla, as there are literally guides after this that say Destroya and Void Ghidorah, respectively, are the strongest Godzilla villains of all time. And there's other guides that say Godzilla Ultima is, and all sorts of other stuff that contradicts Kiza Ghidorah being the top dog. In fact, in most guides he's still mentioned in, he's not even mentioned as being one of the more powerful Ghidorahs, let alone one of the more powerful villains. But ignoring that little rant, yeah, with that scaling chain, Vudan would be kind of insane. However, I do think that's hyper inconsistent with what we've seen from Vudan in the lore and in the game itself. So for this, I'm just not going to use it. Ignoring that, if they were actually using Heisei Rodan as Vudan in the lore, like, officially, I'm pretty sure Toho wouldn't exactly be happy about that. So, yeah, I'm just going to assume that that's soft canon at best and non-canon at worst. So even without that, Vudan and Juju are canonically at least connected to a realm that's separate from the base cosmology of Kaiju Universe, and should be at least somewhat supernatural, as Juju is described as basically being a formless/shapeless entity, and Vudan is 100% an undead entity, and the host of Juju. So they're weird, and their scaling is all over the place. I don't think, if you go off just Kaiju Universe scaling, that they beat Final Wars Godzilla. But if you were to use potential cross-scaling that might still be soft canon to the game, then yeah, they would destroy Final Wars Godzilla and System Man. Now, the last member of the whole flying kaiju group here is Mothman. And the reason I'm not going to talk about him too much is because, one, his lore is weird and we don't really get anything concrete from it. Two, unlike the other kaijus, it's not really explained what his place in the verse is, like, at all. And three, the only real hints we get is that he might be comparable to the Moonlight Beast, which, if he is, would put him well above the other flying kaiju and actually make him one of the top 4 or 5 strongest kaiju in the series. But again, his lore's so weird and like vague that you can't really get that impression. So I don't know. My simple response to how powerful he would be is, I guess you can either compare him to top tiers in the verse, or say he's just only comparable to the other flying kaiju, which is going to be, as you'll see later, a pretty substantial difference in power. So for him, I'm just not going to really talk about him outside, like maybe mentioning him when I get to the Moonlight Beast later. Next, we have a very strange place of power for the verse with 3 kaijus that are kind of hard to place, with Kaguru, Fei Mao, and Typhloran. All 3 of these kaiju, I feel off what we see of them and what we know of them, are under the 2 highest categories of kaiju that I'll get to after this, as well as the man-made weapons that were made to combat kaiju / mechs that aren't necessarily confirmed to be man-made, but are also able to combat kaiju. But above basically any kaiju that isn't like approaching the higher tiers of power in the verse. In other words, they're strong, but they're not the strongest, and they're under the stronger kaijus, but they're not so far under them that they're like completely like pathetic in comparison. They're like a midpoint for the verse, and this is probably where most kaijus added in the future of the game would be at power. At least that's where I'm going to assume they're probably going to be at, unless they lean very heavily into higher ends of power, which they might do, or kind of dial it back a bit. But as of right now, this is very much like the midpoint, the like average level of power for the verse. And all these guys, again, just kind of downscale off of higher tier characters who have some decent stuff that can get decently high. Some of the characters arguably scale to stuff like thunderstorms. There's also a character that they would downscale off of that I'm putting above them that has enough power to drain an entire forest, which I actually calc myself, and that gets fairly impressive in terms of power, but none of it really gets past the hydrogen bomb tier, or even to some of the very, very low ends for some of the stuff that Final Wars Godzilla scales to in base. So, just like pretty much every kaiju prior to them, they kind of just get folded off a massive stats difference. As Final Wars Godzilla is confirmed stronger than and completely basically immune to man-made weapons, every man-made weapon, it's basically confirmed that humanity cannot stop Godzilla. And this is the same humanity that was fairly confident they could stop the simulation of the Gorath meteor. The simulation isn't the real meteor, but I mean, they did think this was a real event, so them being confident they could stop it at the time is pretty telling. And this meteor has been calced pretty much in the large planetary to even dwarf star ranges of destructive power from the simulation itself. And they would have had to have actually been able to destroy that with their weapons, or at least knock it away from Earth, which even on the lowest possible ends would be very high in the moon level. But you can argue that they could just outright match the raw power of the meteor, which would be consistent with Kaiser Ghidorah being confirmed capable of destroying the Earth from the surface, which would typically be in the large planetary of the dwarf star ranges as well as Godzilla having statements that implies he could potentially do the same, and even Gigan having arguments of being a civilization ender, as well as having some lore feats that involve continents basically getting nuked. So yeah, Final Wars Godzilla is pretty overpowered, and these kaiju, though definitely stronger than like the earlier kaijus that in this video, definitely aren't touching him in terms of raw power. But now we get to the 3, what I'm going to classify as the big boys. Starting off with the weakest of these 3 biggest categories, we have the mechs. Nutcracker and Hestasis. Both of these 2 fight fairly similarly, both utilizing piercing weapons and having their own special abilities, with Hestasys being a lot more defensive and the Nutcracker being a lot more offensive. Though their abilities are quite different, their overall fighting style and placement in the verse most likely isn't. As Hestasys is likely on the higher tiers of the mechs that, from what very little we know, were most likely above most of the kaiju in the verse, only below some of the top tiers that I'll be mentioning here in a second, and they're actually officially stated below at least one of these kaiju that I'll be talking about. The only kaiju in the verse that's actually officially stated above the entirety of the mechs, as if it could take on every single one of them at once and win. But there is another kaiju that I think you could argue is arguably more powerful than this one. That's a topic for a little later down the line. But these two are definitely stronger than the mid-tier kaijus, and unlike the other kaijus in the verse, they do technically downscale off of top tiers in the verse. Now, I won't really go too far into the downscaling, as even if we did take this to higher levels, at best they'd be comparable to some of the lower stuff for Final Wars. I don't think they'd be outright matching Final Wars, Godzilla's large planetary to dwarf star range arguments, and I definitely don't think they'd be able to cope with the combat adaptation, which boosts that power even further, and they definitely aren't messing with the Kaiser amp, so I still think they lose here. But unlike everything else in this video up to this point, due to the downscaling they'd receive, they could potentially draw blood or even badly injure Final Wars Godzilla if Godzilla gets careless, especially if it's these two both jumping him at once. So I'm sure a lot of people are probably waiting for this downscaling. I'll mention how far they downscale here in a minute, but they aren't comparable to the top tiers in terms of raw power. They're just not hundreds of times under them. Next, we get to the second strongest class of kaiju in the verse, what I'm dubbing the Behemoth class. So, how high do these kaiju scale? And well, some of them are comparable to thunderstorms, or at least kind of argued to be comparable to them. At least they're stated to be connected to them in some way. Another one of these kaijus was able to drain an entire forest completely of life. Now, that's a very strange feat to try to calculate, so what I did is I basically took the largest forest in Europe, as this thing is based around European mythology, I believe, and took the most common tree that you'd find within that forest, determined how many calories the average tree would have to use per day. This is a pretty low end for it, as you'd have to drain a forest of life, you'd probably have to take more energy than that from it. But this is just me trying to scale a feat that would be very hard to calculate to begin with, and then making a couple estimates for how many trees would be in there based on the average amount of trees within an acre of a forest, and then taking how many acres is in that forest, which made me get a high end, a low end, a mid end, and a wink end for how many trees is in the forest. I then took calculations for the average calories the trees would have, so I have a low end, a high end, and a mid end for each of those scenarios, each of those versions of the forest, and then I calced all of them into tons of TNT from calories. It got some numbers, but they aren't really that great. It ended up being between city block level and small town level. In other words, it's around early nuclear bombs. So, that's pretty impressive, but everything I've mentioned so far is kind of evidence that isn't really above, too far above what you can already get off just gameplay feats. So this feat isn't anywhere near as impressive as I thought it was going to be at first. Granted, this is a lower end. Even if you amped it up by 5 times, it's still not getting past mid-town level, which is still not very impressive in comparison to the stuff I just mentioned for Godzilla. So yeah, Behemoth class kaiju are definitely strong, and one of them actually has statements that imply that it might be able to reverse the melting of ice caps, which is obviously a very impressive feat, and you could argue all the way up to country ranges for this. But yeah, that's still, again, not very comparable to what Godzilla has. So the Behemoth class kaiju are definitely a huge step up, from everything prior, as they actually do have some pretty decent lore arguments and actual feats to scale them off of, other than just being like, hey, they did this in gameplay and they downscale off of all this. Oh, and they probably upscale human weapons. These guys actually have some backstory and feats you can use, which does get them some pretty decent arguments, and some arguments that would put them a bunch above a lot of the other kaiju in game. But yeah, Godzilla's still probably running through them. In fact, I would argue that Hestesis and the Nutcracker, at least on a lore scaling end, are both probably stronger than these kaiju. So that leaves us with the final category, of which there's only 3 kaiju, and these are what I'm referring to as God tier kaiju. Starting off with the strangest and weirdest to scale one, we have the Moonlight Beast. This thing is pretty much confirmed in its lore to have been worshipped by humans at some point. It's also stated to have come from a world that is no longer there. Now, there's a lot of debate that you could have as to what this means, whether this means a version of Earth, like a version of history that we no longer have, or like a literal different dimension or something. It's debatable. We know alternate dimensions do exist within the Kaiju universe, like reality and the cosmology of it, as that's what Juju is from. And there is similarities between Juju and the Moonlight Beast, as both are supernatural entities. There's even arguments that the Mothman in the series might also be from that. And there is some evidence that theoretical physics and stuff might also be involved in the verse with some of Vargoth's stuff. So you can argue that this thing literally came from a different universe. It's also described as being the opposite of God, and implied to be a God-level entity. So you could debate a lot as to what that's implying, but regardless, I think off just its stance in the verse as a being that is pretty much confirmed to be like one of the strongest things in the series, and something that has statements like literally being a anti-god demon monster that was worshipped by people and may or may not be from an alternate existence, one it may or may not have had control over, warrants it being above pretty much everything else in the verse that doesn't also have some pretty absurd statements. So if you were to take this at the highest end, which I wouldn't do because there isn't a lot of context or really backing for it, you could argue like universal levels off this if you think that it would scale to this world that's no longer there, or whatever. But I don't think there's enough proof to actually back that, so I'm not going to do that here. I do think it would still scale to the other 2 in this category, though, which are already pretty overpowered. Next we have Thermonuclear Incineros, and by proxy, Thermonuclear Incineros is confirmed stronger than Base Incineros, as they're actually 2 separate members of maybe the same species or maybe different species that are just very similar. Regardless, though, he's confirmed the more powerful of the 2, and this is backed up by gameplay, as well as stuff in the lore for him. So, by proxy, he's upscaling a character that can already cause earthquakes, canonically, with pretty basic melee attacks. Earthquakes that do have potential descriptions of maybe shaking entire tectonic plates, which is obviously extremely impressive, and a more impressive physical feat than anything we see within the Final Wars movie, as well as anything backed consistently within the Final Wars continuity, outside like energy feats, obviously. I'm talking about physical feats, not like beams and stuff. Obviously, I've already mentioned that you can get large planetary dwarf star arguments off Kaiser Ghidorah and Final Wars Godzilla. So when it comes to energy beams, yeah, they're beating earthquakes and stuff, but potential earthquakes that's shaking an entire tectonic plate, like violently, would be above anything that Final Wars Godzilla has shown in terms of raw physicals. Outside, arguably, his Kaiser form if you really hype up his multipliers. However, it's important to note that we can't really say 100% certain how powerful the earthquakes are, as the descriptions are pretty vague. All we know is his attacks can cause earthquakes pretty consistently. So, he can make earthquakes. However, Thermo Incineros would not only be a lot physically stronger, but he has statements comparing him directly to the sun. And not like in like a whole like figure of speech way, like he's like directly compared to the sun, like stated to rival its power outright, which is a pretty insane statement and power jump for the verse. But I mean, they just called the Moonlight Beast a like anti-god monster, so I mean, who am I to judge? And there's arguments that like Juju and Vudan are like literally like Heisei level stuff. Not to mention, you could argue Juju is literally a higher dimensional being if you think that that extra dimension is extra dimensional or something. Regardless, though, yeah, this statement pretty much says that, yeah, thermonuclear Incineros is arguably star level by default off that. It should also be pointed out, you can argue in the description of thermonuclear Incineros that they might even be arguing thermonuclear Incineros can beat Vargoth in a 1v1 fight, as that might be the unknown creature of the deep that they describe as having an inner star and all that in that description. If thermonuclear Incineros could beat and absorb Vargoth's power, there is no, contest. He is absolutely a star-level entity. Not to mention that they already basically say that thermonuclear Incineros is comparable to the sun itself. They don't say he's like the sun, or his power is similar to the sun, or that its heat similar to the sun, or anything like that. They straight up say 100% he is rivaling or on par with the sun itself, which is star level, obviously. So yeah, we basically have a living star now. And it doesn't end there. Now we get to Vargoth, who, unless you think thermonuclear Incineros actually kills a version of Vargoth, or something along those lines, in my opinion, is the strongest entity in the entire Kaiju universe series. 100% the strongest Kaiju there. For starters, Vargoth is just 100% stated to be strong enough to basically 1v everything, the entirety of Ahestasis's team, which is several very powerful mechs that are considered fairly decent in verse. And he was just gonna fight them all at once and win. And from the description, it doesn't seem like he would have struggled all that much, though the mechs being able to fight something like him at all is incredibly impressive, as you'll see here in a minute. So right there, he's already placed himself in verse as a major threat, off a feat that he doesn't technically ever even need to show. He's just stated to be that strong outright, and this is backed up in verse with how he's placed and what he's described as. Add on that he is born of a dead star. Now, a dead star can mean a lot of things in this context, and for this, I'm going to have to kind of take my own liberties on what they mean here. Originally, I thought by dead star they meant a white dwarf star, which is sort of a dead star. However, this can mean a lot of different things as well. It can mean something like a gravistar, or a black hole as well, or even just a star that's about to go supernova, or even just the remnants of a supernova. It can mean quite a bit of things. However, I think since he is based on Space Godzilla, he's described as descending into the depths, so most likely descending into something, like a singularity, and the fact that his origins include clear references to Space Godzilla's, they are probably referring to a black hole here. I don't think it makes sense for him to be born of a white dwarf star, as it just doesn't line up with his inspiration or origin as much. And just because it would be maybe a little bit more consistent with statements for other Kaiju in verse, his overall power in verse is already above them. So I don't think the consistency argument really matters here if he's already arguably stronger than everything else. So, in my opinion, I do think he was born of a black hole. And you could argue a white dwarf star, you could argue a gravistar, you could argue the remnants of a supernova, whatever. But from what I've seen in his description, from the fact he's based very heavily on Space Godzilla, as well as Godzilla Ultima, I feel it makes the most sense for him to be born of a black hole and to have descended into a singularity, which is already incredibly impressive. And to further back why I'm placing him as the #1 spot, in his official bio, it is stated outright that if he was to essentially appear on Earth, or rise from the depths or whatever, he would absorb the sun and then fire its light upon the Earth. Now, I've heard arguments of people saying that this just means he would absorb the sun's light, or it means absorbing sun as in catching some sun, or some figure of speech along those lines. I don't think they would word it as absorb the sun if they meant just absorbing the sun's energy or absorbing the sun's light. I don't think they would word it that way if they just meant he's draining power from the sun. I don't think they would just say, hey, he absorbs the sun. I feel like they're being pretty clear with what they mean here with that one. Add on that his whole character is essentially just a living black hole. Absorbing stars would make sense. And it's consistent with other characters like Thermonuclear Incineros, who not only is stated to be able to eat the quote-unquote inner star of another kaiju, which should be star levels, is considered comparable to him, who was, stated to be comparable to the sun itself. So if there's already backing for characters being on that level, and then there's statements for characters like the Moonlight Beast potentially being older than the Earth, as I said that humans worshipped it. Re-looking at its bio, it's actually not humans that are worshipping it, it's just some humanoid species that probably predated humans. So, it's even weirder now. When you have literal characters described as like gods, characters that are pretty much confirmed to be comparable to stars on 2 separate occasions in one simple bio, and then that bio might even reference Vargoth himself, add on that Vargoth himself is born from a celestial body that would have to be at least somewhat comparable to a star no matter how you slice it, and that he arguably survived stuff like a singularity. I don't think him absorbing the sun is too much of a stretch. And obviously absorbing something like the sun is a pretty absurd feat. Add on that he's already arguably on that level to begin with, as it would be his own energy drawing the sun in to do something like that. And that he arguably already survived stuff like singularities and a black hole, potentially even absorbing that as well. Or at least absorbing lots of energy from it, as that seems to kind of be his thing. So with all that out of the way, does Final Wars Godzilla have any sort of response to this? And none that are really backed up well. The only real scaling chain within the Final Wars continuity that can really be used here to kind of argue he might be able to rival this level of power is Kaiser Ghidorah being stated to have cosmic energy or cosmic level firepower, which in certain contexts could be argued to be in the solar system ranges. However, it can also be a figure of speech. It can also just mean cosmic as in cosmic from space. It doesn't necessarily have to mean cosmic as in the tiering system's version of cosmic that didn't even exist yet at the time when this statement was made. So, yeah, you could argue maybe off that one statement, but that one statement is kind of debunked by the film itself, never showcasing or mentioning anything on this level. Whereas, at least in Kaiju Universe's case, several pieces of lore and several statements back up the very high star ends of power and potentially even higher stuff. And again, there's insanely high arguments for Kaiju Universe that aren't even those star ends. Like if you want to take some of the statements for the Moonlight Beast or Voodon and Juju hyper literally. So, do I think Final Wars Godzilla could survive Kaiju Universe? Yes and no. I think he could beat the vast majority of the verse, very easily in fact. But I don't think he would beat the top 3. And arguably top 4 if you think Mothman fighting the Moonlight Beast is meant to be taken hyper literally. So, there's 3 to 4 kaijus in the series that I do think beat him consistently in a fight. Obviously, there's arguments to be made that he could speed blitz them, as he does have better speed ends, as Kaiju Universe is really just capping at FTL as of right now, with there really not being any arguments to get past that. There's still going to be a huge power gap. Final Wars Godzilla on a consistent end caps at Dwarf Star level, and more consistently is only in the large planetary ranges. You can argue higher, but that's only if you really hype up his combat evolution, which has no real official multipliers. And even at the highest end, he wouldn't even be approaching the lower end of star level, which Vargoth and Thermonuclear Incineros are blatantly at the start. So, no, I don't think he would beat the top 3 to 4 kaijus in the series. I think he would find it easy to deal with almost anything else, but against a literal living star and a guy that's sole purpose is to cause the apocalypse by absorbing the sun, as well as a pretty much ancient god monster demon thing, he's probably not winning. Anyways, that's my take on this. I think Kaiju Universe is a little underrated in power from all the downplay I've heard on it. So I may make more videos on this in the future. I'm also going to give Final Wars Godzilla a win on my channel at some point in the near future. I don't think I've given him one since he beat Omni-Man like forever ago. So I might have to do that at some point. So, you know, Final Wars fans don't rip my throat out for this. Regardless though, if you liked the video, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.